I was just struck by, we all know as people of faith in different religious traditions that everything in life is connected. We are all connected to each other, to the earth, to the transcendent, no matter what our different traditions say. And I was listening to Chris talk about Thomas Merton, and I admit I don't know much about Thomas Merton, but I did get my degree at Columbia, and I went back to the Catholic Church at Columbia after drifting away for many years, and of course the Catholic campus ministry is Thomas Merton's place, so I'm very familiar with who Thomas Merton is, even though I'm a little bit lazy about having not read as much as I should have. And I also met my wife at the Catholic campus ministry with Thomas Merton. And Bishop Marc was talking about the Vietnam War, and my wife was born in Saigon and left in 1975 on a U.S. military transport that landed in Camp Pendleton in California a few hours before the airport was bombed, and otherwise they wouldn't have made it out. Which makes me think not only are the connections, that we think of the connections, but and this goes to Chris's paradoxes, the fact that we can have, out of great evil can come great good. And this is something that I think about all the time, and I can never really understand it. But I think it's very true in my life and everybody else's life, that, you know, these interconnections, that even today, I share connections with all of you that I never thought I had just listening to you speak. And it's really, really profound. As for myself, as was introduced, it makes me sound grander than I actually am. I was an economist at the IMF for many years. Why did I kind of move away from there? Well, during the 2007 global financial crisis, which you've probably heard something about here, when my fellow economists were calling it a technical problem of capital ratios and leverage ratios and budget deficits and this and that, my gut was telling me, this is not a technical problem, this is not an economic problem, this is a moral problem, this is an ethical problem, and there's something profoundly wrong here. So the next step of that is, if you accept that's true, where do you go for answers? Well, what is the foundation? Where do you go for answers to a moral problem or an ethical problem? And the answer is, you go to the world's religious traditions, because let's face it, religions have been asking these questions for thousands of years. So that's where you go. And economics is a kind of a peculiar thing, because today it's kind of lost its way. But, economics used to be a branch of moral philosophy. It used to be interested in questions like, what is the right thing to do? It goes back to Aristotle, who actually said, our goal, what we're made for, is not to make money or for material success. It's for human flourishing, to live the good life. And all religious traditions affirm that, right? From Buddhists to Confucians to Christians to Muslims, everybody would affirm that idea. And then, who's the founder of modern economics? People say Adam Smith. What do you think? When you hear Adam Smith, what do you think? Invisible hand, free markets, individual competition, do your own thing, out for yourself. Okay, who was Adam Smith? Adam Smith was a professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow University. His second book was The Wealth of Nations, where he said some of that stuff. His most important book was called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he asked, and his key question was, what is the right thing to do? How do we treat people with respect and dignity? Do we hear much about that today? Not really, not really. So this is, my background and where I'm coming from, why I've turned to the world of religion to ask these questions and to answer these questions. Because, my background is in Catholic social teaching, but I think if you get to the root of it, the values of Catholic social teaching, the inherent dignity of every human person, the whole idea of the common good, the fact that we are social creatures, we are by nature cooperative. All religions affirm that. Modern neuroscientists and neurobiologists are now doing all these tests and saying, we're actually cooperative creatures. Our brains are wired to work together and cooperate. So, religions have been saying that for 3,000 or 4,000 years, folks. There's nothing new there. There's absolutely nothing new. So, if you want wisdom, go to the world's religious traditions. So with that background, I'm going to ask one question to the panelists, and then I do have my eye on the clock. So I want to leave time for all of you to ask your questions too. And my question is this, and I'm going to wind it up a little bit. is you think of it like I've said that you get the values and virtues come from religious traditions. And if I look back at the 20th century or the 19th century, and some of the most awful people, I would say, were the enemies of religion, anti-religious. I think of Hitler, I think of Stalin, I think of Pol Pot, these kinds of characters. You know, they're all these totalitarian, anti-religious people. The great heroes of the 20th century were animated by their religion. We've heard of Martin Luther King. We can talk about Gandhi. We can talk about Nelson Mandela, many, many others, all animated by religious teachings. And yet in our society today, especially in America, when we talk about problems of social justice or these big issues that our panelists have talked about, the default seems to be, let's look for technical solutions. When you talk about healthcare or climate change, you'll hear people talking about technical solutions, you know, scientific solutions. That's all fine. But you rarely hear about the moral and religious dimension of this. So my question to the panelists is, how do we get our voice back in the public square? Who wants to go first? Let's. Somebody can volunteer, or I'll just pick somebody at random. How about that? Okay, we'll go in order they spoke. Chris.
Thanks. Just very briefly, I anticipate, I think if I feel hope on this point, out of my own tradition, I think Pope Francis has been, both in his words and in his symbolic actions, has been a great breath of fresh air in terms of a public figure across traditions that people are drawn to. And I'll just gesture to, his forthcoming environmental encyclical, I think will be a very important moment. Already getting a lot of pushback before it's even been published. But there you'll see a theological basis, a spiritual basis for care, relationship with the environment. And so I think in Pope Francis, you're seeing a genuine person who's acting out of a deep spiritual root, out of humility, describes himself as a sinner, careful about judgment, etc. So it's been some time since we've felt hope in the Catholic tradition from the top down, and others might disagree with me on that, but in Pope Francis I see a great sort of a kindling, not only because of him, but because he awakens feelings, truths in us that have been asleep for some time.
Absolutely. And I can just say that 2 weeks ago, I helped organize at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences at the Vatican a gathering of top climate scientists and development experts, along with top religious leaders, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and Sikh. And the great thing was the religious leaders all affirmed the science and the imperative to take action. And the scientists also affirmed that this is a moral question as well. So that gave me great hope. And everybody is awaiting this encyclical with bated breath. And it is coming out in June, so we should all read it. Bishop Marc.
It's a great question. As long as the church was able to speak with one voice, when there was one church, it was not easy, but easier. And the place there that I would point to is just war theory. So, starting with Augustine, this body of thought developed, believing before Augustine that everyone believed as Christians that it was wrong ever to go to war. Christians were pacifists.
Right.
With Augustine, not alone, but with Augustine moving forward, he made an argument, a good argument, that said, well, wars are going on whether we take part or not. So we need to think about how we could make them less unholy, less sinful. They're always sinful, less sinful. So finally, a body of thought was produced that was called just war theory. And it did have an effect. It had an effect in making wars stopping some wars that never should be started, or making the prosecution of wars better. By the time we have many churches and many voices and many religions being voiced in a postmodern kind of way that we're all recognizing there's not one voice, we have a problem in that regard, because which is not a bad problem, but it's a problem. Yeah. So that we have many voices saying, well, yes, this war is okay. Yeah. I'm behind this war. Or no, God says we shouldn't be at war. In my mind, it came crashing into my consciousness at the beginning of Desert Storm, our first entry into Iraq war, when the then president, the elder Bush, who is an Episcopalian, did not choose to have a conversation when requested by the then presiding bishop. So he just said no. That was, for me, a big moment of, well, we can't even get a hearing in that regard. So I would conclude this by saying I think that all of us, we need to maintain the multiplicity of voices. I respect and I pray for Pope Francis, but on many issues he's not ever going to speak unless God answers my prayers. On several issues that are important to me and to the church I represent, right? So I want all those voices that are spiritually based to be privileged, all of them, multiple, not a minority voice, but a multiple voice. And I think the way we do that is stop letting the secular media tell our stories or not tell our stories.
Yeah. All right. Absolutely.
So what I mean by that is over the human sexuality issue, the struggle in the Anglican Communion, New York Times reporter interviewed me for 2 hours and didn't use one word of what I said. Now, I said some good things. And I said them pretty well, but I had very, very carefully constructed a narrative which was not the one that the reporter wanted to already file.
Right.
So what the reporter wanted to file was the tiny, wealthy Episcopal Church in the United States is at odds with Nigeria, which is 17 million Anglicans. Would you comment on that, Bishop Andrus? And I said, the Episcopal Church has beautiful partnerships in Africa. We are working on the AIDS pandemic all over Africa. We are working on poverty all over Africa. And I can point to, and I did, point to some beautiful partnerships in particular. Well, that was of no interest. So I think it's time for us to actually create, and maybe, you know, the Festival of Faiths is not a bad platform, to create, if you will, a news service that tells the stories from our multiple faith voices. Because there's some beautiful stories out there, and there's some also terrible stories that are not actually being reported. So that's my answer.
And that's a great answer. Thank you. Okay. Ambassador.
Well, I think it was surmised. It was brilliantly surmised. So we can...
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
perfect.
I think it was brilliantly said.
In that case, I will turn in this direction.